Before Mr. Stengel assumed this position, he spent 7 years as the managing editor of Time. And prior to that, from 2004 to 2006, he was the president and chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Mr. Stengel has had, well, I would say, a rather, because the crowd is a mix of both. It is truly an honor to have you with us here today. On behalf of everyone at India Today Media Institute, please help me welcome Mr. Stengel with a huge round of applause. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much. Hi. Hello. How is everyone today? So what is the title of my speech? Evolution of the Media in the United States. I can talk about that. So how's everything going? So how many of you are undergrads? Raise your hand. How many of you are graduate students? So, wow. So it's about 50-50. So if you study journalism and media as an undergraduate, would you also study it in grad school? How many of the grad students studied media and journalism as undergraduates? Oh, it seems like most of you didn't. All right, so I'm really glad to be with you today. And I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in media in America and why that presages what will happen in India. So, and by the way, does anybody have a copy of India Today here? That red border that you see on it? You know where that comes from, right? Yeah. Time, in 1923, Time launched, and Henry Luce was the creator of it. And basically, it was a black and white magazine. And what they decided to do was put that red border on it, because that would make it more attractive to people to buy on the newsstand, because they weren't used to seeing color. And that became a copyright and a template. In fact, I think for years we used to try to sue India Today because of the use of the red border, but India libel laws and copyright laws were such that we never got any satisfaction out of that. But by the way, speaking of when Time launched in 1923, anybody want to guess how many daily newspapers there were in New York City? By the way, there are 3 daily newspapers in New York City now. In 1923, there were 26. And when Luce created Time, part of the reason he created it was this idea that there was believe it or not, this is what they felt in the 1920s, that there was so much media out there. It was so confusing to people. They wanted to have one publication that summed it up, that they could kind of cut through all of the dross and everything out there in a way that people would understand what was going on in the news. So there was media consolidation even then. What we see now is a situation where there's that same blooming confusion that is out there, and people need to have something that kind of cuts through that. So when I became editor of Time in 2006, basically, it was before so much had changed in media. I used to always say that the hardest thing in media is to start a new brand, and one of the easiest things is to kill an old one. Well, that turns out to be 180 degrees wrong. If you look at what's happened since 2006, there has been the most incredible growth in media in human history. There are more new brands that have been started in those kind of 10 or 15 years than probably in the 50 years before that. So if you look at competition that Time had, you know what, I'd love a water too. If you look at at the competition that Time had, it was very narrow. There were just a few networks, there were a few newspapers, and then in those 15 years, you basically had the rise of social media, you had the rise of Facebook, you had publications like BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. You had, and last year, the Washington Post, which was one of the great brands in American journalism, sell for almost nothing. How many of you look at BuzzFeed? You know BuzzFeed? So BuzzFeed is an online publication that now has greater traffic than even the New York Times, greater traffic than the Washington Post, in part because they use search engine optimization. They have clever headlines. They create content for what people want. And that has a much larger value even than the Washington Post now. So one of the things that I saw when I was editor of Time was that the communication was changing, right? That one of the things in American media people always bemoan is the fact that the media is consolidating. That I lived in Philadelphia for a while, and they said, well, we don't have any foreign correspondents in Philadelphia anymore. The Chicago Tribune got rid of all their foreign correspondents. The Los Angeles Times got rid of all their foreign correspondents. And everyone bemoans the fact that journalism is consolidating. But the reason that those publications had foreign correspondents in the first place was because if you lived in Philadelphia, you couldn't read or know what the people in Chicago were reading. And if you lived in Chicago, you couldn't read or know what people in Los Angeles were reading. So everybody sent their own foreign correspondents there. Now, of course, you can read the Paris newspapers, you can read the London newspapers. Why is there any reason to actually send correspondence anymore? There is you can see that present, that first-person content that you could never see before in human history. So I think that this kind of model that the media has created is in the process of being destroyed. And one of the things that I saw at Time was the fact that people were sort of they wanted to get information on their phones. So the reason this whole model is changing is because the fact is that anybody at any time can get the entire sum of human information and human knowledge on their phone. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then I'll recover. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
My question is that this 24/7 news culture,
Yeah.
selling of broadsheets in America, that is broadsheets like big brands which are selling with the online, converting in themselves into online portals or online magazines. And the second thing is the localization of content in American media, which is not evident in Indian media. Means Indian media generally goes for the national content, a story which is happening at national level, like Prime Minister's speech or something. While in America, newsmen looks for the local contents, like city-wise. Each and every state is having their own newspaper.
Yeah.
I can give you one instance.
So here everybody goes for a national...
Generally, they prefer to go for national news. Like you must have read about the Trayvon Martin tragedy, in which during the presidential election when Trayvon Martin was killed by a white man, that particular story, pushed back the presidential election almost for 6 months. That was the strength of a local story. Over that is why it is happening that local stories are getting momentum in USA while Indian media is looking for the national news story. How it is beneficial for American media to look for local content and avoid the national stories.
The answer to that is complicated. The federalism in the U.S. there's a kind of devolution of power. There's the central government, and then there are the states, and the states have often had kind of priority. Because of the fact that there was no mass communication for so long, local newspapers became kind of powerful. And what happened was there was a kind of consolidation as mass communication came in. Local newspapers started dying out. But now you have a kind of resurgence of local because, in fact, the only people that can do that, the only people who are interested in it are small publications because that's the only way that they survive. The kind of mass media in the U.S. is changing radically. There's a guy named Jeff Jarvis who has a website called Buzz Machine, who's talking about the end of mass media because, in fact, because of digital technology, you can go to a website and they know you, right? So, in fact, part of the problem and consolidation is that you want now when you go to the New York Times website that you might go there 3 or 4 times during the day, and you want them to know you and say, well, you were here earlier and you read this story. That is a capability that is going to exist in the future. And basically, the mass model is going to be disintegrated because basically you can serve people individually. And I actually think the future of journalism is a much more service-oriented proposition where you can serve people individually. It won't be a mass operation anymore. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that India has such a mass media culture. But again, as more and more people have smartphones, you will be able to pull the information that you want. I mean, part of the whole idea of the mass media is that you give people a menu. You don't necessarily know what you want, and you give them a gigantic menu, and they can choose whatever they want. Well, now they can just pull that. They don't even have to take that menu. They can just search for what they want. So, in fact, one of the things that in social science that we've seen in the U.S., and it's a theory which I kind of dispute, but the theory is that because of the way media is tailored now, and because of digital technology, you only pull the point of view that already confirms what you know already, and that the kind of serendipity of mass media, where you saw different points of view, doesn't exist anymore. I actually think the internet gives you a serendipity that didn't exist before, but basically you can just look for information that confirms what you already think.
Like you look at Huffington Post, which started as an online portal. Now it's above popular than Washington Post and New York Times in USA.
Yeah.
That is the thing which you are talking about. The digital content will take lead over print and other mediums. That is what I precisely say, that you mean to say that digital media will overtake over traditional media. That is what you mean to say in America.
So say that again, though.
Digital media,
Yeah.
the digital technology will take over traditional media like
Yes.
newspaper. That is what you meant to say.
Yes, I mean, one of the things, and I was talking with the dean earlier, that the print is still vibrant here. I mean, print is such a declining industry in the U.S. And in fact, if you think about it again, I mean, you guys are all young, but your children will actually think, man, it's kind of amazing that once upon a time in human history, we went to a forest, we chopped down a bunch of trees, we pulped them, we turned it into paper, we bought ink, put that ink on a paper, and then actually physically delivered it to people, right? I mean, we did that because there was no way of actually delivering information except in a physical way. I mean, now there's absolutely no reason for that. I mean, I just a couple of months ago ended my print subscription to the New York Times because I get it on my phone or I get it on my computer. I mean, that is for someone like me who's been a journalist for 35 years, I mean, that's a kind of revolutionary thing. And that also suggests that the future of the print industry is not very rosy, at least in America. I assume, the U.S. is sort of at the pointy end of the spear, and all of these things will happen 10, 15 years later in other places. I mean, India will have 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 million people come online with smartphones in the next few years. I mean, those are all potential subscribers to information.
So, on that, I think with digitization, and actually I don't know if it's digitization or a convergence of all media, there are two things about bias. One is that you have a lot of it because it's democratized in terms of information flow, from prosumers. But on the other hand, the traditional media bias, what happens to that? So she has a question on that.
So tell me something about media bias in US and the watchdog groups that attempt to find the right facts behind biased reporting and unfounded claims.
So bias about...
Media bias, essentially, is, so it could be political bias or other forms of bias.
So I do think the media is biased, and I've always thought that the media is biased in favor of getting your story on the front page, getting your face on the evening news. Journalists are biased about getting their own story out there. I think the notion of, and I'm sort of disagreeing with the premise of your question, I think the notion that journalists have political biases, at least in the U.S., is kind of a canard. I think they are biased in favor of their own getting credit, winning prizes, being famous, etc. I've seen many times people who I suspected had one political point of view did a story that actually undermined that political point of view because it got them on the front page. I mean, I had many, many journalists who worked for me. I had no idea what their political biases were, and they had no idea what mine were. And in fact, my general view is that journalists, because they become journalists in part because they don't have political biases. If you have a very strong political bias, you'll go into politics. I mean, I know that probably goes against what you think about bias. And even if you take a place like Fox News in the U.S., which is considered to be a conservative organ and a Republican entity, I mean, basically, people have they assume, they go to work there as regular journalists, but every organization has a kind of primer of the things that it cares about and that make sense to it, and I think people adapt to it. I don't think there's an actual political bias. Are you thinking that there's a particular bias that's out there? Okay, I'm sorry, I knocked that down.
Also, when you're talking about, say, Fox News, where so are you saying that the agenda is so clear to the public that they don't look at it as bias because they are pro-Republican? Whereas actually, I mean, they stand out also because they're the only pro-Republican channels.
I mean, social science has confirmed this, but H.L. Mencken said many years ago, the only unbiased point of view is the one that agrees with mine. I mean, most people, Fox News doesn't see themselves as biased, just the way the New York Times doesn't see themselves as biased. They fit into it. They have a kind of schema and worldview that people then conform to. I don't think people are looking to create and do stories that conform to a particular.
But we were also talking about prosumers. Remember, I was just mentioning that. I think just to take that thread forward, do you think that the consumers/producers right now that we all are have a role to play in the kind of media? I mean, are we taking that bias forward in a dangerous way? I mean, can we start a war?
Well, so, I mean, what would be your bias? I mean, your bias is in favor of free flow of information.
It's the flow of information that I'm talking about. It could be, like you say, a kind of a canard that I'm spreading, right? And nobody's there to stop me, except that it's not, I mean, it's not even news. Nobody's going to stop that. That's why I said information versus, it's misinformation. So are the media really addressing the problem of the prosumer spreading falsehood under the name of information?
I have never seen in my journalistic career, either for people who worked for me or people that I observed elsewhere, who purposely stopped reporting on a story because it undermined a political point of view that they had. I mean, people again are biased in favor of reporting, of getting to the truth, even if it doesn't conform with their political bias. That's my prejudice. That's my bias. I mean, I may be wrong about that, but.
So that brings us to something that's burning in India, which is about sensationalism. Okay, if you watch the media or if you just simply read any of our magazines, including our own, you will see that we believe in really driving a point home in no uncertain terms, and sometimes sensationalizing issues with the use of certain headlines or a certain tone. If you look at our news channels, they're always yelling at each other. Gentleman right here has a question about that. Yeah.
Sir, recently I've read in an online article that there is a rise of yellow journalism in US, especially in the northern region. So my question is to you is that, do you agree with this trend of yellow journalism in US?
So can you repeat that for me? Thanks.
My question is that recently in an article I have read that there is yellow journalism is very rising in US. My question is that, do you agree with this trend of yellow journalism in US?
Do you think there is a rise of yellow journalism in the US right
now? Of yellow journalism? I actually think there's an epidemic of boring journalism in the U.S. I mean, to your question, there's a famous line about, why is the trapeze artist up there? Well, to get our attention. I mean, for me, so much of journalism you have to expend a certain amount of energy to get people's attention. You have to grab them by the collar and say, here, pay attention. And part of that is being entertaining. I mean, I've never been prejudiced against, I'm prejudiced against dull, gray journalism. I think there's less kind of yellow journalism, less sensational journalism in the U.S. now than there's been many times in American history. There's a whole now category of celebrity journalism, which is more fun and maybe even a little bit salacious. But that's about movie stars and television stars. I mean, I think the journalism you see on the Obama administration, it's pretty tame. It's not sensationalistic at all. It could tolerate being a little bit more so, actually.
See, I have a question. In India, we are facing a very serious problem nowadays, that is of paid news.
Of what news?
Paid news.
Yeah.
And particularly this problem is considered more serious during elections. Election Commission of India has been fighting this problem, and they have suggested the government that some kind of legislation should be worked out to put a check on this problem. We have the Press Council of India, which has studied completely this paid news, and they have come out with certain recommendations. So I want to know what is the status of paid news in the US.
So explain to me what that is, though, how that works.
Wherein the payment is done by either directly for the publication of a news, or somebody else might be paying for you so that the news related to your political activities or electioneering, etc., can be published.
Right. And is that a new phenomenon or an old phenomenon?
It's an old phenomenon, but it's new in the sense that it's being done nowadays more blatantly. Wherein a lot of payment is done by somebody, for instance, on behalf of a political party, and the publication concerned will take care of the publicity and the election-related news of that political party during the elections.
Yeah. And you make a distinction between that and advertising. It's essentially
there is no. I mean, actually, that should be considered advertisement, but there is no mention of the advertisement. All that appear in the form of news only.
Yeah. One of my heroes was a man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was ambassador to India many years ago. And one of the things that he said years ago was that you're entitled to your own opinions, you're not entitled to your own facts. And of course, everybody agrees with that. But now we're living in an era where there's more information than any time in human history, and yet at the same time, people feel entitled to their own facts. They dispute something that is true versus something that is not true and say, well, I can find evidence to support this. I mean, part of what you're talking about is part of this new world that we live in where people find it harder to discriminate between fact and fiction. And in fact, we see this in the Russian information space. We see this in terms of what ISIL or ISIS has been doing. We see it in the political space, that people that fasten on the information that already confirms their point of view and considers it a fact. I mean, I don't know what to do about that. I mean, one of the things that I've been doing in government is working on anti-ISIL communication, anti-Russian communication, and part of the problem is that those audiences can't make a distinction between fact and fiction. I mean, frankly, this is an issue that you all will have to solve. I mean, I don't know how to do that other than to say, this is the fact. Here is information that confirms it. There's interviews, there's data, there are artifacts, but people then still don't accept it. And so during political campaigns, that's a prime time situation where people actually don't examine the evidence or examine the data. They just look for things that confirm their bias. So I agree that that's a problem. I just don't know really what to do about it. I mean, that's that you all have to figure out. I do think, the great challenge for journalism in the 21st century is figuring out how to create an information product that people accept as a verification of reality and something that might actually make them change their mind about a particular situation.
Okay, so the whole problem right now, I'm up here, but I'm going to pass the mic over to her, who has the actual question, is about how we are going to describe the new form of journalism, because there's information flow from everywhere, unlike before where it used to be pretty much a one-way phenomenon. So she has a question about that.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, sir. I'm Soumya Mishra, and I stand here from Yarn School of Mass Communication. I'm an undergraduate, and my question to you is that the definition of journalism that we study in media schools here is basically the circulation of information and just passing on information from one place to another, right? The truth. And what is actually happening in the market today, in the media industry today, is pretty much different. The whole circumstances, the whole situation is just too different from what we study in books. So what is your say about it?
One of the things that I used to say when I was at Time was that our job was to convert information into knowledge. What do I mean by that? Information is undifferentiated. What journalists really need to do, the best journalists, is to say, here's the information, here's what both sides or all the different sides say, here's my point of view on it. I'm an expert, I know this I know more about it than you do. That to me is knowledge, not information. And again, one of the things that will be true about media in the 21st century is people will have an unlimited supply of information. But information is undifferentiated. The job of the journalist is to take that information, create it into something that people will understand and will make sense to them and will give them a point of view. I mean, I have to say, I've always thought that this idea of journalistic objectivity was a kind of illusion. When I became editor, I used to say, I don't want you to summarize one point of view and then another point of view and say to the reader, you decide. There's a kind of false equivalency that happens in media that we term objectivity. So what you see, particularly you see a lot of this on television, it'll be, you'll have an advocate that will come on and say, the moon is made of green cheese. And then someone else will come on and say, well, no, it's not. The moon is made out of rocks and it orbits the sun. The point of view that the moon is made out of green cheese is not a valid point of view. It's not objective to have somebody out there saying that the moon is made out of green cheese. One of the things that I think media has to do is you have to shun the point of view which we can agree is illogical, is not scientific, that doesn't merit having a debate about. And again, part of the other kind of the narrowness of journalistic perception is that there are two sides to every issue. Well, they're not. Some issues don't have two sides. Some issues have 16 sides. But part of what we do in terms of reducing that for readers or viewers is to pretend that there's an equivalency between two points of view which actually are not equally valid.
So you mean to say that there is one fact, there's a fact about something, and to the same thing you cannot have opinions. A fact remains a fact. Like it's day, so it remains day. I don't think that's what he said. Right? So we cannot have opinions about it, that it is a day, somebody's saying it's night, so we cannot have that, right?
Well, so
that's what is happening nowadays.
Well, it is what's happening. So if you take an example, what happened in Crimea, where you had President Putin saying there were no Russian soldiers in Crimea. Well, that isn't, at a certain point, that's not a debate, right? You can't have someone come and say, well, I'm saying why I think there were Russian soldiers in Crimea, and I'm saying why there weren't. I mean, that's an established fact. That's not debatable. But so many news organizations, because they don't want to seem subjective, they want to seem objective, they present both things as a debate when it's not a debate. I mean, as a consumer of news, I want the news organization that I follow to say, no, this is the reality, and it's not debatable. We can debate something else. We can debate Putin's policy and whether he's trying to reestablish the Soviet Union. That is something that's debatable. It's not debatable that there were Russian soldiers in Crimea.
Okay, I'm now to your left.
Yeah.
I keep moving around.
Okay.
You have to remember.
Scared me. Okay.
I'm just nowhere. Anyway, so actually that brings us to news management, because I think that a lot of what's happening today is there's just so much free flow of information that it seems that somebody out there needs to kind of gatekeep. It's always been happening. However, the gatekeeping job is far more complex today.
Right.
Now, therefore, it places a lot of, like you were saying, there's no foreign correspondent in Philadelphia anymore. The gatekeeper has to be so much more vigilant. The primary source of information, though, such as yourselves, as diplomats, for example, the United States has been known to to keep the media updated on a daily basis in a very, very open fashion, or at least well-managed fashion. Her question is going to be related to that.
Hello, sir. Myself, Anjali. So my question is, how you react to a public opinion, being a diplomatic, how you react to the question or the request being came from the public, and what's your opinion about the diplomats or the problems related to that in the U.S. position? Means, actually, I want to say how you respond to that question, how you react to that questions or the query being a public diplomat.
So how do I respond to public opinion on diplomatic issues?
No, as a diplomat, how would you respond to public opinion per se? For example, in the United States, there would be public opinion. Is that what you take into consideration as a diplomat when you are briefing the media, for example?
Well, Abraham Lincoln, the American president, said public opinion is everything. Every politician has to listen to public opinion. One of the things I've always found amusing is that politicians will say, I don't listen to polls. And what polls really are a reflection or mirror of public opinion. And if you substituted the term public opinion for polls, and the politician says, I don't listen to public opinion, everybody would think that that person was silly. But we pay attention to public opinion only in part in the sense of if they don't understand policy, right? I mean, I am not trying to sway public opinion. I'm trying to present in an honest and informative and transparent way what our policy is and why we're doing things. But if I read and discover from public opinion that people don't understand what our policy is, I want to explain it. I'm really not in the business now of trying to sway public opinion, and I wasn't in the business before as a journalist of trying to sway public opinion. I want to mirror it. I want to understand why people think the things that they do and help explain things, but I'm not in the business of trying to sway it. And one of the things that, now that I'm in public diplomacy and public affairs, one of the classic phrases for what public diplomacy does is winning hearts and minds, which I think is an unfortunate phrase. Because I actually think it's very, very difficult to win a heart and win a mind if people already disagree with you. It's less difficult to explain something. So basically, I want to explain something to you even if you disagree with me. I don't want to persuade you that I'm right, but I want you to understand the reason that we do what we do, even if you disagree with it. Because to me, part of what democracy embodies and what the United States reflects is the fact that we try to explain things. We try to be transparent about what our motives, we try to be transparent about what our goals are. That's what democracy is. So even if someone might disagree with our policy, which often happens, I hope they say, well, at least they're democratic and they believe in democratic values and I can support that, even if I don't always support the policy.
Okay, so staying with news management, one of the things that's always come up in the Indian context, in the Indian news television context, is these televised debates that happen. They happen on CNN, but they happen much more, let's say, vigorously in India. And so, I mean, what's the real role of a news organization?
Sir, this is Sushmita. Sir, I would like to listen your opinion that whether the news channel institutions shouldn't be made more responsible for giving up some solution for the social issues rather than just, outcasting the problems in front of the public. I want to listen up your opinion for that.
Now, I think it's a fair question, and I think people, consumers are often looking for solutions, and they get frustrated by a news entity that just, again, presents the situation, whether it's poverty, whether it's, unemployment. Again, one of the things that you've seen in the U.S. over the years is that so many news organizations, instead of just presenting the problem, they have a segment called Solutions or Solving the Situation or whatever it is. I mean, that does create loyalty with viewers, and I think viewers are often frustrated when you don't necessarily come to a conclusion and you don't offer some kind of agenda for solving the situation. I think that's a very good way to go. And that also dovetails with what I was saying earlier, the fact that journalism ultimately will become much more of a service industry because it can be tailored to you individually. If you want a solution, you will only subscribe to that publication or read that story that offers you a solution. You don't need someone else summarizing a problem that you already understand. Okay.
Okay, you might want to.
We are here talking about evolution of media. I wanted to ask you, isn't the evolution of media directly related to technological development? We have come down from print to television to now digitization. So isn't the evolution directly proportional to the development of technology? What would you say about that?
So, so what is your thesis about that?
I actually think that as technology would develop, media would change accordingly. I personally feel that. What would you say about it?
So I often say, and I'm going to disagree with something I said, that new technology is just a tool, but then therefore is neutral. I think that's not true. I think technology changes cultural form and changes even the way our brain perceives things. So for example, there was a book by a Nobel laureate in the 60s called Technology and Cultural Form. And he used the example of, this. I'm going to really date myself, the long playing record. So when I grew up, music was on records. But when I was really young, they were just 45s. And then somebody developed the technology for the album, which could contain 8 or 9 or 10 songs. And as a child of the 60s, we thought an album was a kind of organic, natural cultural form. In fact, it was just a form of technology. And so what we've seen with social media, with television, changes our perceptions of cultural form. And I think it begins to change the way our brain processes information. There's a tremendous amount of social science now about how social media changes our perceptions. And people your age are able to actually, I believe, focus on multiple things, in part because of what social media does. People in my generation say, well, you lack individual focus. I think the way the brain is working is evolving so that, in fact, things will be adapted to the way you look at that via social media. So I actually think it's a positive change, even though people of my generation are often critical of it.
I have been instructed that we have time for only one question and answer. So we're going to take a question that relates more to international, I guess, dissemination of information from her right then.
Hello, sir. My name is Shweta. So my question is, how does United States media influence developing countries like India or Pakistan?
So you could answer that better than I can, right? How does United States media influence India or Pakistan?
But what is the agenda? What is the agenda, I guess?
I mean, again, one of my prejudices about media is that it's kind of insular. Journalists are, I've explained to people in government that journalists often focus on the same thing at the same time and have the same conclusion for the following reason, that journalists are like a swarm of fish. And you've seen those pictures that why 1,000 fish go in the same direction. Well, a scientist once explained to me that is because they spend all of their time looking at each other, not looking out. That's what journalists do. They spend more time looking at each other than actually looking at the world. And I think journalists are pretty insular, and American journalists are pretty insular, and they're not actually thinking about influencing any other country in the world. They're thinking about their own audience. So it may have the unintentional side effect of influencing coverage around the world, but I actually think that American journalists and American media are not thinking about anything beyond their own borders or even their own subscribers. So there's no conspiracy at all. Is that the last question? I'm sorry about having conked out there for a second, and I hope I recovered. I really enjoyed talking to you all. You all are the future of media and journalism, and I hope I can come back to you and talk another time, and you can come and see me in Washington too. So thank you very much. You want me to stay up here? Okay.
I don't need it now. So, Mr. Stengel, I mean, it's been an absolute honor for you to have you in our midst today. I know it's been a really tight schedule for you, so thank you very much for taking the time out to be in the midst of what you call the future of the media in India, at least. Obviously, there's a whole lot of difference as well as similarities, and increasingly the similarities are from those the sides of journalism that you don't want to see in the United States, actually. Sensationalism and such that the United States is actually giving up on now, but they seem to be on the rise in India. And like we were talking about earlier, I guess we are a few years behind and we'll probably get there. But I hope that it was also, this was also a platform for you to kind of feel the pulse of the Indian young media persons or cub journalists and cub media persons to take back home with you to Washington, D.C. as a token of our appreciation. We just want to give you a small thing that you can use for your desk. If you want to, that's a photo op right there. So they want the photo op.
Matches your tie.
It does. But I'm giving it away.
Yes, Jesse, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Again, thank you all, and continue your good works. Okay.